For centuries, what we now call the United States-Mexico border was not a line of division, but a fluid zone of shared culture, commerce, and community. Yet today, millions live under the shadow of walls, fences, and tightly controlled crossings. How did we arrive here? What were the forces political, economic, cultural that carved one of the world's most heavily policed borders? This is the untold history of why America built a border with Mexico. Ancient and colonial F.R.O.N. TIRs, how land became territory. And territory became divided indigenous landscapes before borders nomadic harmony. Not nationalism long before the idea of a Mexico-United States border ever existed. The vast southwestern land stretching from what is now California through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas were the homelands of deeply rooted indigenous civilizations. These people did not conceive of the land in the modern geopolitical sense. The land was sacred. The boundaries were ecological, cultural, and spiritual, not militarized or surveyed. Groups like the Tohono, O'odham, Apache, Yaqui, Pima, and Pueblo cultures operated within overlapping spheres of influence. Their seasonal migratory routes, water-sharing customs, trading networks, and kinship-based diplomacy formed a fluid, adaptive understanding of space. Trade routes, such as the Turquoise Trail and Salt Trails, moved resources like obsidian, turquoise, and cotton hundreds of miles across what would later become international borders. The concept of land ownership, or even borders as defined by Europeans, was fundamentally foreign. For centuries, these indigenous societies maintained a dynamic equilibrium based on mutual obligations, spiritual beliefs, and respect for natural limits. Mesoamerican influence reaches the north. The influence of Mesoamerican civilizations, most notably the Aztecs and earlier the Toltecs and Teotihuacan, extended far north into what would become the American Southwest. Ceremonial centers, pottery, maize agriculture, and even social-political organization had roots in southern Mexico. Archaeological evidence shows trade and migration, roots running deep into present-day Arizona and New Mexico. The ancestral Pueblones, Anasazi, constructed vast networks of roads and dwellings, such as those at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, engaging in commerce and astronomy. They were contemporaries of powerful states to the south, yet entirely distinct in cosmology and governance. A world without walls, this ancient landscape was defined not by division, but by interconnection. Tribes often moved seasonally in response to rain, game migrations, or religious pilgrimages. They didn't defend territory in the way nation-states do. There was war, yes, but it was usually ritualistic or resource-based, not imperial. The violence that would follow in the colonial period: land seizure, enslavement, forced conversions would introduce entirely new ways of thinking about space, land, and authority. The arrival of empire. Spanish colonial expansion. The Spanish claimed the north. The arrival of the Spanish in the early 16th century fundamentally altered the cultural and political landscape. Hernán Cortés' conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521 opened a floodgate for Spanish expeditions northward. Though driven primarily by the lure of gold, missionaries and conquistadors soon followed trails blazed by indigenous traders. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado S.E. Wulsaling.E. Wulsar expedition was the first major European foray into the American Southwest. He journeyed through what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas in search of the mythical 7 cities of gold. Though he failed to find riches, he helped map out the terrain that would later be claimed by Spain as the northern frontier of New Spain. A frontier, not a border from the start. The Spanish saw the northern regions of their colonial empire not as secure borders, but as a frontera, a buffer zone. It was a loosely governed space, often more imagined than controlled. Spain's interest in these territories was less about permanent settlement and more about defense against rival European powers like the French and British, securing trade routes, and Christianizing indigenous populations. This frontier included Alta California, California, Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico, Texas, Texas, Coahuila, Sonora, Nueva Vizcaya. These regions had porous, barely enforced limits. Colonial control was established, not with walls or borders, but through missions, presidios, military forts, and pueblos towns. The role of Catholic missions. The Catholic Church played an integral role in Spain's colonization process. Missions, often led by Franciscan and Jesuit priests, sought to convert indigenous people while also pacifying them. These were both religious and political institutions. Junipero Serra founded a chain of 21 missions from San Diego to San Francisco, beginning in 1769, in New Mexico. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was a massive uprising against this forced religious conversion, briefly ejecting Spanish authorities. For over a decade, the mission system enforced hierarchical control. Indigenous peoples were relocated, given new Christian names, stripped of their traditions, and forced into agricultural labor. This spiritual colonization fundamentally reshaped the demographics and culture of the Southwest. 3. Economic foundations of the frontier: land grants and settlement to secure claims and reward loyalty. The Spanish crown issued encomiendas and land grants to settlers, creating a class of Spanish ranchers, rancheros, and landowners. These land systems persisted through Mexican independence and were deeply rooted in the colonial legal framework. Large haciendas ranches dominated the northern frontier. Settlers became reliant on indigenous labor, and Spanish families forged alliances, sometimes forcibly, with local populations. The frontier was not empty. It was a complex social mosaic of mestizos, mixed heritage. Criollo Spaniards born in the Americas, indigenous peoples, and African slaves. Trade and mobility. Despite its remoteness, the frontier developed commercial networks. El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro connected Mexico City with Santa Fe. Trade routes linked the Pacific with the Gulf of Mexico, enabling a triangular flow of goods. Cattle, horses, silver, and salt moved freely, further demonstrating that economic logic trumped national boundaries. Mobility defined life in the colonial frontier. Indigenous peoples adapted to Spanish presence, and in many cases, used colonial systems to their advantage, claiming land, trading goods, or joining militias. 4. Resistance, revolts, and unstable control. Persistent indigenous resistance from California to Texas. Indigenous groups fiercely resisted colonial imposition. The Apache and Comanche, in particular, became legendary for their ability to raid Spanish settlements, capture horses, and avoid domination. Spain never fully pacified its frontier. Instead, it created buffer alliances, treating some tribes as allies, Comancheros, for example, while demonizing others. Colonial maps often labeled certain areas as Apache territory or hostile zones, admitting imperial limits. The Pueblo Revolt and its consequences. One of the most significant acts of resistance was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which saw a coalition of Puebloan groups drive out Spanish forces from Santa Fe for 12 years. It was the most successful indigenous uprising in North American history. The revolt forced Spain to re-examine its harsh missionary policies. When Spanish forces returned in 1692, they allowed for greater cultural autonomy, highlighting that resistance could shift colonial policy, albeit temporarily. The early roots of U.S.-Mexico border. Thinking colonial borders are not national borders by the late 18th century. Spanish maps attempted to define the limits of provinces, but these were vague, overlapping, and largely unenforced. Borders in colonial New Spain were not lines, they were zones of influence, negotiation, and instability. This created a frontier where Spanish law was selectively enforced. Indigenous sovereignty persisted. Communities were multilingual and multicultural. Travel was fluid, and trade crossed any theoretical boundary. This history stands in sharp contrast to the militarized and surveilled U.S.-Mexico border of today. The French and Anglo-American threat Spain's real concern in the north wasn't indigenous peoples, but rival empires. French presence in Louisiana and British expansion westward forced Spain to reassert its frontier defenses. Forts were expanded. More missions were built. Settler colonies were encouraged. Yet Spain's colonial model was too thinly stretched. By the time of Mexican independence in 1821, Spain's northern frontier was vulnerable, underdeveloped, and largely dependent on the goodwill, or at least the cooperation, of local populations. Conclusion: a fluid past, a divided future. In summary, the lands that now form the U.S.-Mexico border were once anything but divided. They were home to vibrant civilizations who knew how to live with the land, not carve it up. Spanish colonialism introduced rigid hierarchies, but not strict boundaries. What defined this period was fluidity, adaptation, and coexistence. However tense, the seeds of future conflict over lands, sovereignty, migration, and identity were planted during this era, but the concept of a hard, militarized border was still centuries away. Understanding this chapter is key to seeing how borders are not natural, but historical constructions shaped by empire, resistance, and ultimately, transformation. Mexican independence and the Texas Revolt, from post-colonial aspiration to a fractured borderland. The fall of empire and the rise of a nation, the decline of Spanish rule by the late 18th century. Spain's colonial empire was straining under internal and external pressures. Enlightenment ideas, Creole discontent, economic exploitation, and European wars, including the Napoleonic invasion of Spain, in 1808 cracked the imperial foundation. Then the vast northern territories of New Spain were barely sustainable. Frontier provinces like Tejas, Nuevo Mexico, Alta California, and Sonora were underpopulated, militarily weak, and economically isolated. The empire's resources were concentrated in the urban heartlands Mexico City, Puebla, and Veracruz, leaving the frontiers neglected. The Mexican War of Independence, 1810 to 1821. The movement began on September 16, 1810, when Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a Creole priest, issued the famous Grito de Dolores, a call to arms against Spanish tyranny. Though Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811, the revolution continued under leaders like José María Morelos, Vicente Guerrero, and eventually Agustín de Iturbide by Etienne Babay Archie. After more than a decade of war, Mexico achieved independence through the Plan of Iguala, which promised independence from Spain, preservation of Catholicism, equality for Creoles, and Peninsulares. The Treaty of Cordoba formally ended Spanish rule, and the vast colonial territory became the first Mexican empire under Emperor Iturbide, 1822 to 1823, later transitioning into a republic. The challenge of governing the northern frontier, a nation too vast to rule upon independence. Mexico inherited a territory larger than the United States, spanning from Guatemala to Oregon. But Mexico lacked Spain's bureaucratic machinery, funds, or military might. The government in Mexico City struggled to govern the distant northern provinces. The northern frontier was thinly settled by Mexicans, but home to powerful and often uncooperative indigenous nations like the Comanche, Apache, and Navajo. Cross-border raids, smuggling, and U.S. encroachment were increasing. Structure, communication, and fortifications was virtually non-existent. Historians' insight, V.O. Mexico's post-independence period was plagued by instability. For the borderlands, independence often meant even less oversight than under the Spanish crown. Economic fragmentation, the northern provinces operated with relative autonomy. Many relied on trade with the United States instead of distant Mexico City. For example, New Mexico exported wool and crafts to Missouri via the Santa Fe Trail. Tejanos Mexican Texans sold cattle and hides across the Sabine River to Louisiana. California's rancheros traded with Bostonian ships and squash in Alaska. This economic dependency on the U.S. helped set the stage for American expansion into Mexican territory. 3. Mexico's liberal constitution and federal structure, the Constitution of 1824. Mexico's 1824 Constitution established a federal republic similar to that of the United States. It granted states considerable autonomy and aimed to unite a deeply divided population. The northern provinces were grouped into Coahuila y Tejos to ensure administrative efficiency. Indigenous people were granted theoretical equality, but were excluded from political power. The Catholic Church remained dominant, but secular liberalism was rising. Settlement policies. Opening the gates. One of the most consequential policies of the early republic was the decision to encourage Anglo-American immigration into Texas to help settle and defend the province. Stephen F. Austin received the first Impresario land grant in 1823 to settle 300 American families. Over the next decade, over 20,000 U.S. immigrants settled in Texas, mostly from the American South. Many brought enslaved people. Despite Mexico's abolition of slavery in 1829, Mexican leaders believed that loyal settlers would provide a buffer against indigenous raids and U.S. encroachment. Instead, they planted the seeds of rebellion. Texas. On the brink, cultures collide. Anglo settlers versus Mexican Lothers from the U.S., mostly Protestant, English-speaking, and culturally aligned with the American South, resisted assimilation into Mexican society. Tensions grew over several issues: language and religion. Mexican officials demanded Spanish fluency and Catholic conversion. Most Anglos refused. Slavery. Mexico banned slavery in 1829. Anglo settlers ignored the law and continued to enslave Africans. Autonomy. Americans were accustomed to self-government and chafed under Mexican bureaucracy. In short, the cultural, legal, and political systems of Mexico clashed with the frontier settlers' values. Mexico tries to regain control, alarmed by Anglo-American resistance and the sheer demographic takeover. The Mexican government passed the law of April 6, 1830, which banned further U.S. immigration, imposed customs duties, established military garrisons in Texas. This law only inflamed tensions further, with settlers accusing Mexico of tyranny. They had come for land, not loyalty. The Texas Revolt, 1835-1836, the road to rebellion by 1835. Tensions had reached a breaking point. Anglo settlers formed militias and local governing bodies, ignoring Mexican authority. Simultaneously, President Antonio López de Santa Anna dissolved the federal constitution and imposed a centralist dictatorship. This gave Texans a unifying cause, not only defending their way of life, but also restoring federalism. Outbreak of War. October 1835. The Battle of Gonzales, symbolized by the common take-it flag, marked the start of armed rebellion. December 1835. Rebels seized San Antonio de Bexar. March 2, 1836. The Texas Declaration of Independence was signed. Texans proclaimed themselves a republic, though Mexican Tejanos participated in the revolt. The leadership and direction were overwhelmingly Anglo-American. The Alamo and Goliad Santa Anna launched a military campaign to crush the rebellion. March 6, 1836. The siege of the Alamo ended with a massacre of all defenders, including Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. March 27, 1836. Over 300 Texan prisoners were executed at the Goliad Massacre. Rather than discouraging resistance, these events galvanized the rebellion. Victory at San Jacinto on April 21, 1836. General Sam Houston led Texan forces to a stunning victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, capturing Santa Anna himself. Santa Anna signed the treaties of Velasco, recognizing Texan independence in exchange for his life. However, Mexico never formally recognized the Republic of Texas. V. A republic between giants 1836 to 1845. The Republic of Texas for nearly a decade. Texas existed as an independent nation, claiming the Rio Grande as its southern border, farther south than the Nueces River, which Mexico considered the true boundary. The republic faced major challenges: unstable government, massive debt, continued threats from Mexico, unrecognized sovereignty. U.S. involvement and expansionism, though Texas was technically independent. It was heavily influenced by the United States. Anglo settlers pushed for annexation. American volunteers and supplies had flooded into the Texas Revolution. Southern U.S. politicians saw Texas as a valuable slave state. Manifest destiny: the belief that the U.S. was destined to spread from coast to coast was gaining ground. Texas was the first major prize in this ideological and territorial campaign. 7. Seeds of the U.S.-Mexico border are sown. A border in dispute. The aftermath of the Texas Revolution created the first clear territorial dispute between the U.S. and Mexico. Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border. Mexico insisted the border remained at the Nueces River. This dispute laid the groundwork for the coming Mexican-American War. The border between the two nations was not yet fixed, but the concept of a divided North America was becoming a reality. Border communities, fragment families, trade routes, and communities along the disputed zone found themselves in limbo. What had once been fluid territory under Mexican control now had competing legal systems, currencies, and armies. Mexico's fragility, Mexico's inability to defend its territorial integrity after Texas's breakaway was a result of political infighting, military coups, economic instability, indigenous resistance, inadequate infrastructure. In contrast, the U.S. had a growing population, industrial strength, a powerful military. It was only a matter of time before more of Mexico's northern lands came under threat. Conclusion: Revolution redraws the map. The Mexican independence movement created a new nation, but it also unleashed instability, fragmentation, and unintended consequences. The settlement of Texas by Anglo-Americans were mainly a policy to strengthen Mexico's frontier backfired spectacularly. The Texas Revolt was more than a local insurrection. It was a precursor to full-scale territorial conquest. It set the legal, military, and ideological foundations for the modern U.S.-Mexico border by introducing the first border conflict over territory: Rio Grande versus Nueces, establishing U.S. precedent for intervening in Mexican territory, paving the way for annexation and the Mexican-American War. In short, the Texas Revolt created the crack in the foundation that would soon split the continent in two. The Mexican-American War and its legacy. The Mexican-American War 1846-1848 stands as one of the most pivotal conflicts shaping the modern boundary between the United States and Mexico. This war not only redrew the map of North America, but also laid the foundation for the tense, complex relationship that still influences border politics today. Its legacy continues to echo in issues of territorial claims, national identity, and the socio-political fabric along the borderlands. Causes of the war. The roots of the war trace back to the expansionist ideology of manifest destiny, a belief that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This belief fueled American ambitions to acquire vast territories, including Texas and the lands further west. Texas annexation. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico after the Texas Revolution. For nearly a decade, Texas was an independent republic, but in 1845, the United States annexed Texas. a move that infuriated Mexico, which never recognized Texas's independence. Border disputes. The primary territorial dispute was over the southern border of Texas. The United States claimed the Rio Grande as the border, while Mexico insisted the boundary was the Nueces River, much farther north. This disagreement set the stage for confrontation. Diplomatic failures. Efforts to negotiate a peaceful settlement failed. The U.S. sent envoys to purchase California and New Mexico, but Mexico refused to sell. Tensions mounted. Outbreak of war in early 1846. President James K. Polk ordered U.S. troops under General Zachary Taylor to the contested Rio Grande area. Skirmishes broke out, and Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil, rallying Congress to declare war on Mexico. On May 13, 1846, major campaigns and battles. Northern Mexico Campaign. General Taylor won decisive battles at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, pushing Mexican forces back across the Rio Grande. California Campaign. In the West, American settlers and naval forces quickly seized California, declaring the short-lived California Republic before the U.S. took control. Mexico City Campaign. The most critical phase was General Winfield Scott's amphibious assault and march to capture Mexico City, the Mexican capital. After a series of brutal battles, Scott's forces occupied the city in September 1847. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The war formally ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848. Its terms reshaped the continent. Mexico ceded more than half of its territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming, known as the Mexican Cession. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and assumed certain claims by American citizens. Against Mexico, the Rio Grande was recognized as the official border of Texas. Immediate aftermath and impact on Mexico. The treaty left Mexico weakened economically, territorially, and politically. The loss was a national trauma, exacerbating internal divisions and contributing to decades of instability. For the United States, the victory and land acquisition fulfilled much of the Manifest Destiny vision, but also intensified sectional conflicts over the extension of slavery into new territories, contributing to the tensions leading to the Civil War. Legacy of the war. On the border demographic changes, the treaty did not erase the presence of Mexicans living in the ceded territories. They became American citizens overnight, creating a new cultural and ethnic dynamic that persists. Border as a political and cultural divide. The new border separated families, communities, and economies. The divide fostered issues of land rights, identity, and citizenship that still affect border relations. Foundation for future conflicts. The legacy of the war set a precedent for U.S. interventionism and territorial expansionism. It sowed seeds of mistrust between the two nations that influenced later border disputes and immigration policies. Economic integration and disparities. The border became a zone of economic exchange and conflict. While trade grew, so did disparities, migration pressures, and cultural blending. Conclusion: the Mexican-American War was more than a military conflict. It was a transformative event that carved out the geopolitical and cultural contours of the modern U.S.-Mexico border. Its legacy is embedded in the physical boundary, the shared yet contested history, and the continuing debates over sovereignty, migration, and identity. Understanding this chapter is essential to grasp why America built a border with Mexico and how that border evolved into a symbol of both division and connection. Demarcation and dispute. The Gadsden Purchase drawing the line on a changing continent. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo may have ended the Mexican-American War in 1848, but it did not settle all questions about the U.S.-Mexico border. In the following years, tensions over boundary lines, economic ambitions, and transportation logistics brought both nations back to the negotiating table. This chapter explores the Gadsden Purchase, a little known but profoundly consequential land deal in 1854 that helped shape the modern U.S.-Mexico border and left a legacy of territorial loss, political controversy, and long-term implications for the borderlands. Section 1. Post-war border confusion. The incomplete border. The Treaty of Guadalupe. Hidalgo outlined the general boundary between the two nations, but left several points vague, especially across the rugged and sparsely inhabited territories of southern New Mexico and Arizona. Ambiguities, topographical inaccuracies, and poor surveys led to conflicting interpretations of the Rio Grande's path and the boundaries of the Mexican cession. Cross-border tensions. U.S. settlers moving into the region frequently clashed with Native American groups and Mexican officials, further complicating local governance. The Mesilla Valley dispute. Central to the tensions was the Mesilla Valley, an agriculturally rich and strategically located area near present-day Las Cruces, New Mexico. The U.S. claimed the land was part of the 1848 acquisition, while Mexico insisted it remained theirs. The Mesilla Valley was crucial for a proposed Southern Transcontinental Railroad, which would need a relatively flat, snow-free route. Mexico's control of the area was an obstacle to American expansionist ambitions, particularly among Southern politicians and railroad tycoons. Section 2. Manifest Destiny. Marches on the railroad. Imperative. In the early 1850s, the United States was gripped by the dream of connecting its east and west coasts by rail. Several routes were proposed. Northern route, backed by Northern interests, but hampered by winter conditions and mountain ranges. Southern route, supported by Southern politicians as the most practical due to flat desert terrain and milder weather. For the Southern route to succeed, however, the U.S. needed full control over the land south of the Gila River, much of which was still Mexican territory. Entered James Gadsden. President Franklin Pierce appointed James Gadsden, a South Carolina railroad executive and diplomat, as minister to Mexico in 1853. His mission: negotiate the purchase of land necessary for a southern railroad and resolve remaining border disputes. Gadsden was an ardent expansionist and former president of the South Carolina Railroad Company. His instructions included offers to purchase not only the required land for the railroad, but potentially all of Baja California and additional Mexican territories. A broader expansion plan that ultimately failed. Section 3. The Gadsden Purchase negotiation. Mexico's fragile state. Mexico, under the leadership of President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, was politically and economically unstable. Beset by rebellions and bankruptcy, Santa Anna saw selling territory as a means to generate revenue and consolidate power. However, he faced intense backlash from within Mexico for even considering the sale of more land to the U.S.-The Agreement. December 30, 1853. The two nations signed the Gadsden Treaty. The U.S. agreed to pay $10 million for 29,670 square miles of land, including the Mesilla Valley and parts of modern-day southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. The treaty established a clear southern boundary, mostly following the Gila River and a newly agreed-upon line below it. The U.S. Senate ratified a revised version of the treaty on April 25, 1854, reducing the size of the land purchase and dropping some controversial provisions. Section 4. Domestic reactions and controversy. American sectionalism. The Gadsden Purchase, like many expansionist actions of the 19th century, became entangled in the growing sectional tensions between North and South. Pro-slavery Southerners hoped the new territory could support slave-based agriculture and bolster Southern political power. Northerners, fearing the spread of slavery and Southern domination, resisted the broader expansionist goals originally proposed by Gadsden. The purchase further inflamed the sectional crisis that would culminate in the Civil War just a few years later. Mexican backlash in Mexico. The sale was viewed as a national humiliation. Santa Anna was denounced for sacrificing national integrity for financial gain. The Venta de la Mesilla sale of La Mesilla became a symbol of Mexico's weakness and vulnerability to U.S. aggression within a year. Santa Anna was overthrown, and his role in the sale contributed to his permanent exile from Mexican politics. Section 5. Defining the border, technicians and surveyors. The international boundary. Commissioned following the treaty, both countries established a joint boundary commission to survey and mark the new border. Engineers faced immense challenges: remote desert terrain, extreme temperatures, hostile Apache groups, and poor funding. Boundary markers, often stone cairns or metal posts, were placed at key points along the line. Many of these would later erode or be relocated. Incomplete demarcation and ongoing conflicts. Despite the treaty, border enforcement was minimal. Lawlessness, smuggling, and migration continued freely across the boundary, which remained more theoretical than physical. Section 6. Indigenous resistance and the unstable frontier, the Apache Wars. The lands acquired in the Gadsden Purchase were part of Apache homelands, including those of the Chiricahua Apache, led by warriors like Cochise and later Geronimo. The U.S. military's expansion into this territory led to decades of conflict, displacement, and violence. The border, from an indigenous perspective, was an artificial construct that cut through ancestral land and trade routes. Cross-border communities. Many communities on both sides of the new border maintained familial, cultural, and economic ties. In places like Nogales, El Paso, and Yuma, the border was porous and unofficial, with ranchers and traders crossing it frequently. This reality would continue until well into the 20th century, when enforcement and immigration controls became more stringent. Section 7. Legacy and long-term implications. A permanent borderline. The Gadsden Purchase cemented the final major territorial acquisition in the contiguous United States and created the modern-day southern border. It solidified U.S. control over the route for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Completed in the 1880s, it also finalized the continental shape of the U.S. map as we know it today. Seeds of border militarization. Though the 1854 border was lightly enforced for decades, the purchase laid the groundwork for later border militarization and surveillance. As U.S. interests expanded, so did the perceived need to control the movement of goods, people, and ideas across the border. Over time, the demarcated line became a political and psychological boundary, an us and them symbol etched into national identities. Modern-day reverberations. The region acquired through the Gadsden Purchase remains central to modern debates about immigration, border security, and cultural exchange. Cities like Tucson, Nogales, and El Paso continue to reflect a binational heritage shaped by centuries of movement and interconnection. The border wall, migration routes, and militarized checkpoints today often stand on or near the very line negotiated in 1854. A narrow strip with an immense impact. Though the Gadsden Purchase covered a comparatively small geographic area, its impact on U.S.-Mexico relations, the development of the American Southwest, and the shaping of national identities has been enormous. It resolved one dispute but sparked countless others over land, sovereignty, citizenship, and culture. As modern debates rage about the nature of the U.S.-Mexico border, the shadow of 1854 looms large, reminding us that a single negotiated line can change the destiny of nations. Railroads, restrictions, and racial divides. From tracks to borders, how transportation and race shaped the American Southwest. Steel rails and invisible lines in the decades following the Gadsden Purchase. The U.S.-Mexico border transformed from a loosely defined frontier into a contested zone defined by economic infrastructure, migration controls, and racial hierarchies. At the heart of this transformation were three powerful forces: railroads, which carved pathways of commerce and control through the desert; Restrictions, as the U.S. federal government began asserting control over movement across the border. And racism, as ideas of Anglo superiority shaped the treatment of Mexican people and indigenous communities. This chapter explores how these forces worked in tandem during the late 19th and early 20th centuries to entrench the U.S. Mexico border as not just a line on a map, but a racial and economic divide with lasting consequences. Section I. Railroads and the American Conquest of the Southwest, the Age of Steel following the Gadsden Purchase. Railroads became the symbol and tool of American expansion in the Southwest. Key developments included the Southern Pacific Railroad, completed in 1883, connected New Orleans to Los Angeles through Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway expanded aggressively through New Mexico and southern Colorado. These railways made the borderlands accessible, profitable, and governable. Why railroads mattered: economic transformation. Railroads turned remote desert outposts into booming towns and trade hubs. Cities like El Paso, Tucson, and Nogales grew rapidly. Migration corridors, railways facilitated the flow of people, American settlers, Chinese laborers, and increasingly, Mexican workers. Surveillance and control. As railroads brought growth, they also brought bureaucracy and the state. Border. Stations were established along key lines, laying the foundation for future immigration enforcement. Section 2. The rise of restrictions, the open border era. For much of the 19th century, the U.S.-Mexico border was open and unguarded. People crossed freely for work, trade, and family. The very idea of illegal immigration didn't yet exist. Changing attitudes toward migration by the 1880s. The U.S. began to shift toward restrictionism, particularly in response to economic downturns and labor competition, rising nativism, and xenophobia, racialized fears of non-white populations. The Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, though not aimed at Mexicans. The Chinese Exclusion Act set a precedent for race-based immigration laws. Many Chinese immigrants sought entry through the Mexican border, leading to increased border inspections in places like El Paso, early deportation systems, often informal and driven by racial profiling. Birth of border control by the 1890s. U.S. authorities began monitoring Mexican crossings, particularly as Mexican laborers came to work on railroads and in agriculture. The Immigration Act of 1903 expanded the federal government's power to exclude undesirables, anarchists, criminals, and the mentally ill, but enforcement was weak and racially selective. Section 3. Racial hierarchies in the borderlands. Anglo superiority and the Mexican problem. As American settlers moved into the Southwest, they brought with them ideas of racial hierarchy. Mexicans were viewed as racially inferior, lazy, childlike, and unfit for citizenship. Indigenous tribes were considered obstacles to progress and were violently displaced. Segregation and discrimination in the expanding towns and cities of the borderlands. Mexican Americans faced segregation in schools, restaurants, and public facilities. In places like Texas, they were often denied voting rights and subjected to Jim Crow-style laws. Mexican workers were paid less, given the most dangerous jobs, and denied labor protections. Resistance and cultural resilience despite discrimination. Mexican communities preserved language, culture, and solidarity. Mutual aid societies, mutualistas, provided social safety nets and political organization. Newspapers, schools, and churches helped maintain a sense of identity and resistance. Section 4. Labor. Migration and control. Mexican labor and the American economy. By the late 19th century, Mexican workers were vital to American industry. Railroads. Mining, agriculture, construction. Employers preferred Mexican labor because it was abundant, mobile, and exploitable. The duality of dependence and exclusion, this created a contradiction that still defines. Border politics. The U.S. needed Mexican labor, but resisted integrating Mexican people. Policies fluctuated between recruitment and rejection, often guided by economic needs rather than ethical considerations. Anti-Mexican violence, Texas Rangers and vigilantes regularly attacked Mexican communities during the Porvenir Massacre 1918 and other atrocities. Law enforcement often racially profiled, brutalized, and killed Mexicans with impunity. Cross-border raids and bandit wars further militarized the region. Section 5. Border. Towns and cultural crossroads by national urbanism, as railroad lines and highways connected communities across the border. Sister cities emerged. El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, Nogales, Calexico, Mexicalized towns became zones of cultural fusion, sharing food, music, families, and economies. Everyday life in a divided land, Mexican children crossed the border daily to attend American schools. American shoppers frequented Mexican markets. Workers moved across the line with minimal interference until restrictions began to grow. Section 6. The Mexican Revolution and American fear turmoil to the South. Mexican Revolution 1910 to 1920 brought millions of refugees and migrants northward. They fled violence, poverty, and upheaval. This led to a surge in border crossings, legal and informal. The U.S. responded with new fears: anarchism, socialism, disease, and foreign radicalism. The Bath Riots and sanitation politics in 1917. El Paso became the site of the infamous Bath Riots. Mexican workers were required to strip and undergo kerosene delousing before entering the U.S. when Carmelita Torres, a 17-year-old Mexican maid, refused and protested. She sparked a riot involving hundreds of women. The Bath Riots symbolize how race, public health, and border enforcement intersected with Mexicans treated as vectors of disease. Section 7. Building the bureaucratic SOSOSC. Building the bureaucratic SOSOSC. Border from railways to regulation. With railroads came infrastructure and eventually regulation. Customs stations began collecting tariffs and inspecting goods. Early border agents worked along railroad depots, tracking migrants and smugglers. Foundations of modern border policy in 1924. The U.S. established the Border Patrol, formalizing enforcement. It began with just 450 officers covering 2,000 miles. Though initially focused on Chinese and European immigrants, it quickly turned to Mexicans who were crossing for work or fleeing instability. A divided future emerges. Lasting impacts of railroad expansion. The railroads brought capitalist penetration of the Southwest, environmental transformation of arid lands into irrigated farms, a permanent infrastructure for surveillance and control, entrenching the racial border. The policies, perceptions, and prejudices of this era institutionalized the racialization of the border. Mexicans were seen not just as outsiders, but as second-class residents. Even on U.S. soil, the border became a line of racial sorting, dividing the white American from the foreign Mexican. Regardless of geography or history, trains, laws, and lines that still shape us. The story of railroads, restrictions, and racial divides is not just one of tracts and treaties. It's a story of how economic ambition, racial ideology, and federal policy coalesced to create the modern U.S.-Mexico border. The legacy of this era remains vividly present. In the checkpoints, in the labor camps, in the barbed wire, in the towns split by fences, and in the lives of millions shaped by a line once drawn for commerce and conquest. Prohibition, revolution, and border policing, how violence, and the Mexican Revolution reshaped the U.S.-Mexico border under pressure. The early 20th century marked a volatile and transformative period along the U.S.-Mexico border. Driven by three major forces: the Mexican Revolution, American Prohibition, and the birth of modern border policing. This era forged new meanings for the boundary separating the two nations. As Mexico was engulfed in civil war and the United States battled organized crime and alcohol smuggling, the borderlands became a hotbed of surveillance, migration, crime, and militarized control. This chapter analyzes how political chaos, moral crusades, and racialized enforcement from 1910 to 1930 permanently altered how the United States saw the Mexican border not as a line of commerce, but as a line of danger, disorder, and defense. The Mexican Revolution and the refugee surge roots of rebellion, 1910. Longtime Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz was challenged by opposition leader Francisco I. Madero, sparking the Mexican Revolution, a multi-factional civil war that raged. For a decade, peasant uprisings, elite betrayals, and foreign interventions turned Mexico into a battlefield. Leaders like Emiliano Zapata, Pancho Villa, and Venustiano Carranza emerged with differing visions of reform, land redistribution, and modernization. Cross-border consequences, the violence drove hundreds of thousands of Mexican civilians north. Refugees settled in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Rebels and agents used U.S. territory as a base to launch raids and import weapons. The U.S. border was now not just a geographic line. It became a refuge, a staging ground, and a security concern. Revolution meets American paranoia, border under siege. Revolution spilled across the border in key incidents. 1916 Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico. Villa attacked the town, killing 18 Americans. In response, the U.S. launched the punitive expedition under General John J. Pershing. American troops entered northern Mexico without permission, escalating diplomatic tensions. Military occupation and surveillance from 1910 to 1920, the U.S. militarized its southern border. National Guard troops and Army units were stationed along the Rio Grande. Towns like El Paso, Laredo, and Nogales became fortresses of surveillance, though aimed at stopping raids. These deployments also targeted migrants and civilians, contributing to racial tensions and human rights abuses. Section 3. Racial Profiling and the Policing of Mexican Threats, Bath Riots, and Sanitary Segregation in 1917. Under the guise of public health, U.S. officials began forcibly disinfecting Mexican laborers at the El Paso-Juarez border. Kerosene baths, nude inspections, and delousing were mandatory for anyone entering the U.S. when 17-year-old Carmelita Torres refused to comply. She led a protest that grew into the Bath Riots. These events marked the beginnings of systemic racialized border policing, linking Mexicans with disease and criminality. Eugenics in border science. This era was also the peak of eugenics in American immigration policy. Mexicans were stereotyped as biologically inferior. Immigration officials saw the border as a filter to prevent degenerates from entering. Policies often included literacy tests, health inspections, deportations without due process, prohibition, and the rise of smuggling. The Volstead Act and alcohol black markets with the passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act in 1920. The United States entered Prohibition, a nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. But on the Mexican side of the border, alcohol remained legal, creating a lucrative smuggling corridor. Tequila, beer, and whiskey poured into U.S. cities through El Paso, San Diego, and Brownsville. Organized crime grew on both sides, involving bootleggers, corrupt officials, and U.S. agents. Vice tourism and border boom tones. Prohibition transformed Mexican border towns into vice capitals for American tourists, whereas Tijuana and Mexicali flourished with bars, casinos, brothels, and dance halls. Border cities catered to Hollywood elites, mobsters, and college students escaping dry America. This era made the border both a zone of escape and a target for moral reformers. Birth of the U.S. Border Patrol, establishing the patrol. 1924. The U.S. Border Patrol was officially created in 1924. Under the Labor Appropriations Act, it began with just 450 agents. Originally focused on stopping Chinese immigrants violating the Exclusion Act, it quickly turned to policing Mexican laborers and smugglers. Expansion of enforcement border patrol operations grew rapidly. Patrolmen often rode horseback or used rail cars, covering massive desert zones. Checkpoints, warrantless searches, and racial profiling became standard tools. The patrol operated more like a paramilitary force than a civil agency, empowered to act without judicial oversight. The quota laws and the Mexican exception immigration. Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act 1924 introduced national origin quotas, drastically limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. However, Mexico was excluded from these quotas due to U.S. economic dependency on Mexican labor. Braceros before the Bracero program, even before World War II's Bracero program. The U.S. informally relied on Mexican workers. Railroads, agriculture, and mining industries thrived on seasonal migrant labor. Many workers entered legally or semi-legally, while others crossed without inspection. Despite economic reliance, all these workers faced surveillance, abuse, and deportation. Raids, repatriations, and deportation machines. Early deportation campaigns by the late 1920s. Amid economic downturns and racist backlash, the U.S. launched aggressive deportation drives. Mexican repatriation began, culminating in the 1930s. Entire families, including U.S. citizens, were coerced, arrested, and sent to Mexico. No courts, no justice. Deportations were carried out without legal counsel. Appeals, judicial hearings. Border enforcement was arbitrary and racialized. It's often used to cleanse cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Detroit of undesirable populations. Section 8. The border as spectacle and symbol. Border shows and nationalism in the 1920s and 30s. Border fencing and policing were dramatized for the public. Fencing campaigns began near urban areas like El Paso and San Diego. Border shows and media portrayals depicted Border Patrol agents as American heroes. This constructed the border as a national defense front, even in times of peace. The invention of the illegal alien. This era marked a semantic and political turning point. The term illegal alien entered public discourse. Mexicans, once seen as labor assets, were now branded as lawbreakers and intruders. The groundwork for modern border militarization and immigration hostility was now fully in place. From crisis to system, the era between 1910 and 1930 saw the U.S. Mexico border transform from a fluid space of migration and exchange into a hardened zone of control, surveillance, and racial division. The combined pressures of Mexican Revolution, Prohibition fueled smuggling, and xenophobic immigration policies forced the U.S. to formalize a border regime grounded in exclusion, enforcement, and fear. Though built on a foundation of labor demand and cultural exchange, the border was increasingly imagined as a wall, not a bridge, separating the American citizen from the foreign threat. This legacy, established a century ago, still reverberates through today's debates over walls, migration, and the meaning of national belonging. The Bracero program and restrictive laws. Work, borders, and the illusion of welcome. 1942 to 1964. Welcome mat, or revolving door. World War II thrust the United States into an unprecedented labor shortage, particularly in its vast agricultural and railroad sectors, with millions of American men sent to fight overseas. The U.S. turned to its southern neighbor for help, not by opening its borders fully, but by carefully negotiating a guest worker system. The Bracero program. Running from 1942 to 1964. The Bracero program brought millions of Mexican laborers into the United States under the promise of fair wages, humane treatment, and temporary contracts. But as the program expanded, it became both a lifeline and a trap, enabling economic exploitation while deepening the architecture of racialized immigration policy. Alongside it, The rise of restrictive immigration laws sought to criminalize the very people American industries had invited. This chapter explores the paradox of the Bracero program and how restrictive immigration policies grew in its shadow, creating an enduring contradiction, a system that depends on migrants while punishing them for crossing the line. The birth of the Bracero program: war, labor, and negotiation. By 1942, American farms and railroads were in crisis. Millions of U.S. workers had been drafted into the military. Labor-intensive crops like cotton, sugar beets, and fruits faced rotting in fields. Railroad operations crucial to the war effort were slowing down. The U.S. and Mexican governments signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement in August 1942, launching the Bracero program from brazo, Spanish for arm. Key features of the program: the agreement laid out several principles. Braceros would receive guaranteed wages, housing, food, and return transportation. Contracts would be temporary, usually 6 months. Workers would not replace domestic labor unless absolutely necessary. However, pritis, employers exploited loopholes, and U.S. enforcement was weak to non-existent. Braceros on the ground, labor, and exploitation conditions in the fields: braces worked in grueling conditions, long hours under blistering sun with minimal breaks, exposure to pesticides and unsafe machinery, unsanitary housing, overcrowded barracks, and insufficient food rations. Despite contractual promises, many braceros were underpaid or not paid at all, had wages deducted for savings that were never returned, faced verbal abuse and racial discrimination from employers and local communities. A legal gray zone: braceros existed in a legal limbo, not protected by U.S. labor laws, no path to citizenship, no right to strike, unionize, or seek legal recourse. Their status as temporary made them perpetual outsiders, welcome when needed, disposable when not. The racial and economic logic of the program profits over people. American agribusiness loved the Bracero program. Wages were lower than for domestic workers. Braceros lacked legal protections, making them easier to control. The federal government subsidized recruitment, contracts, and transportation. This created a two-tiered labor system: braceros in the fields, exploited and unprotected; American workers in more regulated and unionized environments. Racial narratives: politicians and employers promoted the idea that Mexicans were naturally suited for hard labor. Braceros were temporary tools, not future citizens. The border was a filter to control which Mexicans entered, and for how long. These ideas helped justify continued racial inequality in both policy and culture. The rise of illegal immigration: labor demand exceeds supplies. The Bracero program expanded, so did unauthorized immigration. Many Mexicans crossed the border without contracts to seek the same work. Employers often preferred undocumented workers. No paperwork, no oversight, no limits. Thus began the contradiction that defines U.S. immigration. The government officially restricted entry. The economy unofficially demanded more laborers, then allowed the criminalization of the undocumented. In response, the U.S. began a campaign to crack down on unauthorized entry. Border patrol operations intensified. Language shifted. Migrants were no longer workers, but illegals. Yet many deported workers were simply brought back again through Bracero contracts, revealing the absurd cycle of welcome and rejection. Operation Wetback, 1954. Political panic and national hysteria by the early 1950s. Political rhetoric turned toxic. Mexican migrants were blamed for crime, disease, and job theft. Despite their economic contributions, they were seen as a brown tide threatening American purity. In 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized Operation Wetback, a mass deportation campaign. The human cost: over 1 million people were rounded up. Many were U.S. citizens wrongly deported. Families were separated. belongings confiscated, and lives upended. Deportees were dumped in remote Mexican border towns, often without food or water. Operation Wetback marked the rise of mass border enforcement as a federal priority, further entrenching the idea that migration was a threat, not a human need. Voices of resistance and advocacy, the Braceros, speak despite censorship and repression. Braceros organized, petitions and strikes were quietly circulated. Some told their stories to journalists and activists. Bracero abuses were documented in reports that reached Congress by the late 1950s. Emerging Labor Alliance is the United Farm Workers UFW, led by Cesar Chavez, would later oppose the Bracero program. Chavez saw Braceros as tools to suppress wages and union efforts. He fought for an end to guest worker systems and a push for labor rights across all farm sectors. The end of the Bracero program changing politics. Changing priorities by the early 1960s. The political winds were shifting. Civil rights movements highlighted the hypocrisy of using racial labor systems. Agricultural mechanization began reducing labor demand. Media coverage exposed widespread abuse of Bracero. President Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress allowed the Bracero program to expire in 1964. What was left behind in its wake? The program left displaced workers who had built lives in the U.S. but now had no legal status. Employers addicted to cheap labor and unprepared for wage increases. A border enforcement system now used to targeting and criminalizing Mexican migrants, regardless of their labor contributions. The legacy of restrictive laws, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Though the Bracero program ended, restrictive immigration policy accelerated. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act ended national origin quotas but capped immigration from the Western Hemisphere for the first time. This created a bottleneck. Legal pathways narrowed, but demand and need remained high. Permanent illegality with few legal options remaining. Mexican migration increasingly took place outside the law. Millions of undocumented workers crossed for jobs in fields, restaurants, and construction. The term illegal immigrant became normalized and weaponized. The post-Bracero era institutionalized illegalness as a central feature of Mexican life in America. Section 9. Cultural memory and historical amnesia. The Braceros forgotten. Despite its massive scale, the Bracero program was buried in public memory. History textbooks rarely mention it. Survivors were often silent, ashamed, forgotten, or excluded from narratives of labor and immigration. Recovering the stories in recent years, scholars and activists have worked to preserve oral histories, such as Smithsonian's Bracero History Archive, local museum exhibits and digital storytelling projects, memoirs and documentaries by children and grandchildren of Braceristes' efforts show that behind the policies were human lives full of dreams, trauma, and resilience. The contradiction that built a border. The Bracero program stands as a stark symbol of the paradox at the heart of U.S.-Mexico border history. Country that invites workers while excluding people. Between 1942 and 1964, the U.S. federal government created a system of legal exploitation, then tore it down, only to replace it with a deeper regime of restriction, deportation, and criminalization. The ideas and policies born in this era of borders as economic filters, of migrants as temporary, of Mexicans as labor but not citizens continue to dominate immigration politics today. The modern border wall, rhetoric of invasion, and the endless debate over illegals are not new. They are the legacy of an era when the U.S. wanted labor without people, arms without voices, and drew a line to make sure it stayed that way. The modern border state emerges 1965 to 1990s. Enforcement, identity, and the militarization of the line from line to fortress. The U.S.-Mexico border has always been a political space shaped by war, migration, treaties, and labor flows. But in the decades after 1965, it became something more, a powerful symbol of national identity, sovereignty, and fear. What was once a loosely monitored frontier increasingly became a militarized, zone-policed, surveilled, and contested. This chapter explores the emergence of the modern border state, a blend of law enforcement, political rhetoric, economic contradiction, and cultural division. Following the end of the Bracero program and the passing of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the United States transformed its approach to the border. As migration from Mexico and Central America surged, often fueled by U.S. foreign policy itself, the response was not reform or accommodation, but restriction, criminalization, and buildup. Operation Gatekeeper, the rise of the Border Patrol, and the war on drugs all contributed to a shift, from managing border flows to controlling a border imagined as crisis. The 1965 Immigration Act and its unintended consequences, the end of racial quotas. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also called the Hart-Celler Act, abolished the long-standing national origin quotas that had favored European immigrants, established a new system based on family reunification and employment-based immigration, imposed, for the first time, numerical caps on immigration from the Western Hemisphere, 120,000 annual visas. While praised for its civil rights progressivism, the law unintentionally created the modern illegal immigration crisis, a backlog. By design, the new quota system did not reflect labor demand from the U.S. agricultural and service sectors, particularly in the Southwest. Before 1965, over 450,000 Mexicans came legally each year through Bracero-style programs. After 1965, only 20,000 legal Mexican immigrants per year were allowed. This created a growing gap between legal supply and economic demand. The U.S. wanted the labor, but no longer allowed enough visas, leading to a surge in unauthorized migration. The border becomes a battleground. The rise of Border Patrol, though. The U.S. Border Patrol was created in 1924. It remained relatively small and underfunded until the late 1960s and 1970s. Key changes included rapid expansion of agents and funding, especially under Nixon and Reagan, a shift from general monitoring to active interdiction and surveillance, use of military equipment, canine units, helicopters, and fixed checkpoints. By the 1980s, the Border Patrol had grown into a force of thousands with a mission not just to monitor the border, but to defend it. Operation Intercept 1969. In 1969, President Richard Nixon launched Operation Intercept, an aggressive anti-drug initiative. Every vehicle crossing from Mexico was searched for drugs. Wait times at ports of entry stretched to 8 to 12 hours. The operation disrupted daily life and commerce in border towns, though it lasted only 20 days. Operation Intercept was a symbolic turning point, framing the border not just as a migration issue, but a national security threat. The war on drugs and the war on migrants, drugs, and the expansion of surveillance. The 1980s witnessed an escalating war on drugs, which fused with immigration enforcement. New funding for drug interdiction became funding for border militarization. Mexican and Central American migrants were routinely profiled as traffickers. The Border Patrol and local law enforcement began to coordinate operations in border regions. As a result, migration became criminalized by association, even when drug involvement was rare. Crisis, politics, and anti-immigrant backlash. Migration increased in the 1980s due to economic crises, civil wars, and U.S. intervention in Latin America. Conservative politicians pushed a narrative of invasion. Immigrants were described as taking American jobs or draining welfare. Public figures like Pat Buchanan and California Governor Pete Wilson blamed the federal government for losing control of the border. The line between immigrant and criminal began to blur in popular culture and policy. This set the stage for punitive laws and symbolic crackdowns. Section 4. Central America, Refugees. An American hypocrisy, U.S. foreign policy, and forced migration while criminalizing migrants at the border. The U.S. was also funding authoritarian regimes in Guatemala and El Salvador, supporting Contra fighters in Nicaragua, training foreign militaries through programs like School of the Americas. This led to civil wars, massacres, and state terror, displacing millions of civilians who then fled to the U.S. refugees. Denied. Most Central Americans who sought asylum were denied legal status between 1983 and 1990. Only 2% of Salvadoran asylum applications were approved. The U.S. claimed they were economic migrants, not victims of political violence, despite overwhelming evidence. In effect, the U.S. had helped create the crises and then refused to recognize its role. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, amnesty and enforcement in response to mounting pressure. Congress passed IRCA under President Reagan, legalized 2.7 million undocumented immigrants who had been in the country since 1982, criminalized the hiring of undocumented workers, increased border enforcement and penalties for employers. While seen as a major reform, IRCA had mixed results. Legalization worked millions, gained stability. Employer sanctions were rarely enforced. Unauthorized migration resumed quickly. Due to ongoing economic demand and limited legal pathways, militarization continues despite amnesty. IRCA also accelerated enforcement budgets and technology use. Ground sensors, aerial drones, and night vision scopes were deployed. Checkpoints were reinforced far from the actual border. The image of the border as a combat zone became mainstream in media and politics. Operation Gatekeeper and the Wall begins prevention through deterrence in 1994. President Bill Clinton's administration launched Operation Gatekeeper, focused on sealing the border near urban areas like CHL and El Paso, installed fencing, lights, cameras, and triple barrier walls, redirected migrants to more remote and dangerous desert crossings. The goal was not to stop migration entirely, but to make crossings so difficult and deadly that migrants would stop trying. A deadly new reality as a result. Deaths in the desert skyrocketed due to dehydration and exposure. Human smuggling networks became more profitable and dangerous. Thousands of migrants were lost each year. Many never recovered. The U.S. government had not just reinforced the border. It had turned it into a landscape of risk and death. California, identity politics. And Proposition 187, 1994, in California. Anti-immigrant sentiment reached a fever pitch with Prop 187 would deny public education, healthcare, and social services to undocumented immigrants. Required teachers and nurses to report suspected undocumented persons. The measure passed with 59% of the vote, though later struck down as unconstitutional. Backlash and mobilization. Prop 187 sparked a massive Latino mobilization. Protests, boycotts, and mass marches emerged statewide. Voter registration drives lead to a Latino political resurgence in California. The irony was stark. Attempts to exclude and criminalize immigrants helped empower and organize them politically. Building a border identity, culture, and surveillance. Media, film, and the immigrant threat. Hollywood TV and news outlets help shape a narrative. Migrants as drug smugglers, rapists, or anchor babies. Border Patrol agents as lone heroes defending civilization. Films like Sicario, Borderline, and No Country for Old Men painted a grim picture of the borderlands. The media helped Americans internalize the border as a space of threat, even when real threats were minimal. Surveillance and citizenship technology. reinforced this perception. Infrared cameras tracked body heat in the night. Biometric databases collected fingerprints and eye scans. Drones patrolled the skies, while motion sensors lined desert trails. Citizenship became something to prove, especially if your skin was brown, your accent Mexican, or your town near the border. The border as business. The rise of the border industrial complex enforcement became profitable. Companies won multi-million-dollar contracts for fencing, tech, detention facilities, and private prisons. Lobbyists pushed for more border security, even when unauthorized crossings dropped. This created a perverse incentive. The more border problems were hyped, the more funding and contracts flowed. Local economies and dependency. Ironically, many border towns benefited economically from increased security. Jobs in customs, ICE, and border patrol boomed. Restaurants, stores, and rental housing catered to agents. Some communities became economically dependent on the very system they resented. A new border for a new ERB, the late 1990s. The U.S.-Mexico border had been transformed. What was once a fluid space of cultural exchange and labor mobility was now a hardened, militarized frontier. Unauthorized migration had become a permanent feature of U.S. life, not an anomaly. The border itself became a political litmus test for what kind of country America wanted to be. The emergence of the modern border state was not simply about lines on a map. It was about who was allowed to belong, who was cast out, and what stories the nation told itself to justify both. NAFTA, globalization. And the wall begins from open markets to walled borders. How economic integration fueled physical separation. Free trade. Fenced borders. The 1990s ushered in a new era of globalization, one characterized by the rise of free trade agreements, the spread of neoliberal economic policies, and the promise of shared prosperity. At the heart of this transformation stood the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, signed in 1994 by the United States, Mexico, and Canada. NAFTA was sold as a win-win solution that would modernize the Mexican economy, expand markets for American industries, and reduce illegal immigration by addressing its root causes, poverty, and lack of opportunity. Instead, it produced the opposite. The agreement accelerated economic dislocation in Mexico, drove mass migration northward, and coincided with the beginning of a militarized U.S. border enforcement regime. While capital flowed freely, people were increasingly blocked, funneled, and criminalized. This chapter explores how globalization and restriction became two sides of the same coin, and how a policy meant to erase borders economically instead laid the groundwork for the most visible manifestation of the U.S.-Mexico divide, the border wall. NAFTA's origins and the promise of prosperity, the rise of free trade ideology. The late 20th century saw a powerful shift in global economics. Neoliberalism, the idea that free markets, deregulation, and privatization solve social and economic problems, gained traction. Institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and WTO promoted open economies as the key to global development. In the U.S., both Republican and Democratic leaders embraced free trade as a bipartisan goal. NAFTA, structure and goals signed by President George H.W. Bush and implemented by President Bill Clinton. NAFTA aimed to eliminate tariffs between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Increase cross-border investment. Harmonize regulatory standards. Open Mexico to U.S. goods and services. Supporters claimed NAFTA would boost Mexican wages. Curb northbound migration. Create a stable, prosperous North American economic bloc. Winners and losers of NAFTA culture collapse in Mexico. One of NAFTA's most devastating effects was on Mexican agriculture. Cheap, heavily subsidized U.S. corn flooded Mexican markets. Small-scale Mexican farmers couldn't compete and saw incomes collapse. By the early 2000s, Over 2 million Mexican farmers had lost their livelihoods. This loss triggered mass rural urban migration, and for many, northward migration too. The U.S. became the only option. Industrialization without justice and FTA created maquiladoras U-owned factories in Mexican Solis. Indridola Sune Salesa, Mosi, only Ruby Kiss, has the luxurious texture that glides on like La Sasade, and leaves a rich, long-lasting sleaze, leave salune, long-lasting color. Border towns. These employed hundreds of thousands in low-wage, high-exploitation conditions. Workers were often women, laboring in unsafe factories, with few rights. The promise of upward mobility proved illusory. Wages stagnated, even as corporate profits soared. Thus, while trade volume exploded, inequality deepened, both within and between the U.S. and Mexico. Migration in the NAFTA era, the Great Displacement tasked livelihoods crumbled in Mexico. Migration increased, undocumented immigration rose dramatically in the 1990s and early 2000s. Migrants no longer came just for seasonal work. They came to stay, bringing families. Mexican communities grew in places far from the border, the South, Midwest, and beyond. This undermined the political narrative that NAFTA would fix immigration and stoked new fears in the U.S. about an uncontrolled left border. Hypocrisy in motion and FT revealed a stark contradiction. Goods, capital, and services flowed freely. People did not. The U.S. opened the gate to economic integration, but built a physical and legal wall against human movement. Labor was the one input not allowed to move freely in the globalized market. Operation Gatekeeper and the rise of border militarization, the Clinton administration's shift to preempt conservative backlash against NAFTA, President Clinton dramatically increased Border Patrol funding. Launched Operation Gatekeeper in 1994. This initiative included fencing and infrared surveillance at urban crossing points, new Border Patrol agents and resources, a strategy to push migrants into the desert, increasing risks and deaths. Operation Gatekeeper marked the true beginning of modern border militarization. Policing the consequences of policy, the U.S. effectively created the conditions for migration through trade policy, then criminalized the migrants fleeing those very conditions. Deaths in the desert became a regular occurrence. Between 1994 and 2020, over 8,000 migrants died trying to cross, victims of policy-driven deterrence by death. Economic inequality and American anxiety. The American working class under pressure in a theft wasn't just a Mexican story. U.S. manufacturing jobs were outsourced to Mexico and beyond. Wages stagnated in U.S. factory towns. Union power weakened. This bred deep resentment in the U.S., especially in Rust Belt states, hit hard by job loss. Agricultural regions struggling with new global competition. The migrant became the scapegoat, even as the real culprit was corporate globalization. Political weaponization. Politicians from both parties vilified undocumented immigrants to distract from structural economic failures. Linked immigration with crime, terrorism, and drugs, despite weak evidence. Used the border to signal control, even as the root causes of migration were left unaddressed. The result, a border shaped not by rational policy, but by fear, projection, and myth. Border technology and surveillance. The digital border. By the 2000s, the border was no longer just a line in the sand. It was a surveillance machine. Drones, sensors, and facial recognition technologies were deployed. Biometric data was collected from travelers, immigrants, and asylum seekers. DHS created vast databases tracking movement, employment, and legal status. The dream of NAFTA, open borders for capital, had a shadow. Total surveillance for the poor and undocumented. The rise of the virtual wall in place of brick and mortar. A virtual wall emerged. Integrated surveillance systems monitored everything from trucks to footsteps. Contracts with private defense companies boomed. Civil liberties eroded as border logic extended inward, affecting interior cities and even U.S. citizens. The wall began as a physical construct, but ended as a conceptual framework of exclusion. 9/11. And the new border-era terrorism and border conflation after the 9/11 attacks. The U.S. government merged immigration enforcement with counterterrorism, created the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, passed the Patriot Act, giving vast powers to immigration agents. Although the attackers entered legally and were not Mexican, the border with Mexico became the focus of national security panic. Enforcement explosion in the 2000s, the U.S. saw a massive increase in ICE raids. Detention centers expanded to house tens of thousands of immigrants. New legal categories, like aggravated felon, created pathways to deportation for long-term residents. NAFTA may have globalized the economy, but 9/11's globalized fear of the other, and the Mexican migrant became a symbol of disorder. Wall. Rhetoric and reality. The wall before Trump. Long before Donald Trump, border walls were already being built under George W. Bush. The Secure Fence Act 2006 funded hundreds of miles of barriers. Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama all approved wall segments and technology. Yet, none admitted the paradox that the U.S. was punishing the victims of its own trade policy. Trump and the border as Theater. Donald Trump simply amplified an existing trajectory. He turned the wall into a campaign prop, a rally cry, a nationalist monument claimed Mexico would pay for it, a nod to trade imbalance resentment. Rebranded migrants as invaders, invoking imagery of war and apocalypse. The Trump wall, regardless of completion, was less about function and more about performance. The social and human costs, migrant deaths, and family separation by the 2010s and 2020s. The border system's cruelty escalated. Children were separated from parents at detention facilities. Asylum seekers were forced to wait in dangerous Mexican towns under Remain in Mexico policies. Deaths in the desert became normalized. What began with trade turned into a humanitarian crisis. American society, divided. The border became a mirror for America, a reflection of economic inequality, racial anxiety, and political polarization. Red states and blue states diverged sharply on immigration policy. The wall stood as a symbol of division, not just between nations, but within the U.S. itself. NAFTA and the wall that globalization built in NAFTA was meant to dissolve borders, to create a seamless North American economy. But it did so only for goods, not for people. While corporations and investors flowed freely across lines, the Mexican worker remained boxed in, policed, surveilled, and hunted. Globalization created new migrants, even as it criminalized them. The U.S. used free trade to extract value and border enforcement to keep labor out when convenient. The resulting contradiction birthed the wall, physical, legal, and psychological. The wall, then, is not a break from globalization. It is globalization's most concrete consequence. And as we move deeper into the 21st century, we must ask, can a truly connected world be built on the foundation of segregation and exclusion? From border crisis to border industry, a crisis that pays the modern U.S.-Mexico border is more than a political flashpoint. It is an industry worth billions. In the wake of 9/11's increased migration, drug wars, and anti-terror policies, the U.S. reframed the border not only as a security threat, but as a permanent crisis. But behind this endless emergency lies a system of profits, privatization, and power. This chapter explores how the border crisis became a business model, giving rise to a vast border industrial complex, including private detention centers, surveillance contractors, military suppliers, and data analytics firms. It investigates how government policy, media fear, and corporate lobbying turned the border into an engine of economic gain. Regardless of its humanitarian toll, the rise of the permanent crisis narrative crisis as a political weapon in American politics, few phrases carry more weight or vagueness than the term border crisis. Since the late 20th century, politicians have used it to justify emergency powers, win votes through fear, justify massive federal spending. But what exactly is the crisis? Illegal immigration numbers have fluctuated for decades. Violent crime. Rates along the border are often lower than national averages. Yet media and political rhetoric portray the region as out of control. The border, in short, is not just a place, it's a theater of political drama. Post-9/11's transformation after September 11, 2001, the border became a front in the new war on terror. In 2003, the U.S. created the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, a mega-agency that absorbed Immigration and Naturalization Service. INS Customs, U.S. Border Patrol, the new logic. Terrorists might cross the southern border. This justification opened the floodgates for new funding, technology, and militarization. The emergence of the border industrial complex. What is the border industrial complex? Coined by scholars and activists, the term refers to the interconnected network of government agencies, private contractors, and political interests that profit from border enforcement. Much like the military-industrial complex, this system thrives on constant investment, expansion, and crisis narratives. Key players: private prison companies. CoreCivic and GEO Group are two of the largest running immigration detention centers. Defense contractors: Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman supply drones, towers, and surveillance systems. Tech companies: Palantir and Amazon Web Services provide data analytics for ICE and CBP. Lobbying firms. These corporations heavily fund political campaigns to ensure friendly legislation. Detention for dollars: the explosion of immigrant detention. The early 1990s, the U.S. held a few thousand immigrants per day. By 2020, that number soared to over 50,000 daily, the largest immigration detention system in the world. Detention became big business. Per diem rates, private facilities are paid $150 to $300 per detainee per day. Guaranteed quotas, many contracts. Required minimum occupancy levels, even if arrests dropped. This created a perverse incentive. The more people detained, the more money made. Family separation and the business of trauma. The 2018 family separation policy under the Trump administration shocked the world, but also filled beds in detention centers. Children were sent to separate shelters. Contractors were paid millions for food, security, and management. For every new enforcement policy, a new contract followed. Surveillance tech and smart borders high-tech boom instead of building more physical walls. Recent administrations invested in digital walls, motion sensors, infrared cameras, biometric scanners, facial recognition. This created a bonanza. For tech firms, from traditional defense contractors to Silicon Valley startups, biometrics and data valence Palantir technologies helped ICE track and arrest immigrants using big data. Amazon Web Services provides cloud infrastructure for DHS. CBP One app tracks asylum seekers. Collecting sensitive data like facial images and geolocation. Privacy advocates argue this tech erodes civil liberties, turning the border into a zone of constant surveillance. Border budgets and booms. Massive border enforcement budgets have ballooned. 1990 $1.5 billion, 2001 $4.2 billion 2023. Over $25 billion for CBP and ICE combined. The DHS border budget now exceeds all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. Who gets the money? 70% of CBP contracts go to private companies. Millions flow to consultants, developers, and engineers. DHS's revolving door means many officials leave to work for the very companies they once regulated. This self-perpetuating system profits from chaos and invests in its continuation. Wall's symbolism and the Trump surge. Trump's wall. More than concrete, though Trump's promised 2,000-mile wall was never completed. His administration built 452 miles of fencing, mostly replacing old barriers, spent over $15 billion. Much of it diverted from Pentagon funds. The wall became a symbol, not just of national defense, but of identity politics and anti-migrant sentiment. Profiteers of the wall companies that profited from border wall construction include Fisher Sand and Gravel, BFBC, Southwest Valley Constructors. Many received no-bid contracts, raising questions of corruption and favoritism. Asylum, crisis management, and human warehousing. Metering, U.S. policies began slowing down or outright rejecting asylum seekers. Metering limited the number of asylum applicants per day. Remain in Mexico policy forced asylum seekers to stay in dangerous border cities. This created massive makeshift camps in Tijuana, Matamoros, and Juarez. NGOs, human rights, and resistance despite government neglect. Nonprofits and humanitarian groups tried to fill the gap. Legal aid for asylum seekers. Medical care in camps. Court challenges against illegal detentions. Still, the border industry often undermined their efforts, treating aid workers as security threats. Migrant labor and the two-faced border labor demand versus enforcement. Even as the U.S. militarized the border, it relied on undocumented workers in agriculture, construction, and services. Migrants were needed, but not welcomed. Enforcement did not stop labor exploitation, but often worsened it. This contradiction formed a two-faced policy: criminalize immigrants publicly, while profiting from their labor privately. Operation Streamline and mass prosecution launched in the mid-2000s. Operation Streamline introduced mass trials of migrants, up to 70 per courtroom. Immediate jail time for first-time crossers, criminal records for civil immigration violations. This fed into private prison contracts and added to the criminalization of migration. Border as industry, not security. The business of border crisis. A pattern emerged. Declare a border crisis, secure emergency funds. Award contracts to loyal companies, expand the system. Repeat politicians campaign on border chaos, but rarely seek lasting solutions because the crisis itself generates profit and political capital. Lobbyists, revolving doors, and legal capture. Former DHS and CBP officials often become consultants. Join corporate boards, lobby Congress for contracts. This creates a feedback loop of profit, policy, and power. An industry whose goal is not resolution, but persistence. Conclusion: from fortress to economitea's border is no longer just a line of defense. It is a multi-billion-dollar economic zone, built on fear, surveillance, incarceration, and injustice. It is not shaped solely by law or logic, but by lobbyists, contracts, and campaign ads. The border crisis has become an institution, not something to be solved, but something to be sustained. And as long as the public believes in the myth of chaos, the machine will keep running, locking up the poor, enriching the powerful, and redefining the border not as a boundary, but as an industry of control.